Mrs. Hale had worked for the Cauldron Foundation for 23 years, and in that time she had learned to read a room the way a sailor reads weather. She could tell, before a gala began, which table would grow too loud by 9 o'clock, which donor needed to be seated near the exit, and which of the foundation's patrons would cause the wait staff to stand a little straighter simply by walking through the door. Cale Vaughan always caused them to stand straighter. He arrived at 10 minutes past 7, as he always did, not late enough to be theatrical, not early enough to be convenient. His car stopped at the curb and the door was opened by a man Mrs. Hale had seen a dozen times but never heard speak. Vaughan himself stepped out in a charcoal suit that fit like a quiet declaration, and the two foundation staff members posted at the entrance both seemed to forget, for a moment, what they had been about to say to each other. That was the thing about him. He didn't do anything in particular. He simply arrived, and the room reorganized itself around the fact of his presence. He was the foundation's principal patron. Had been for 11 years. He attended the annual gala, wrote the largest check of the evening, spoke to perhaps 4 people, and left before 10. He was not unkind. He was not theatrical. He was simply the kind of man who generated a certain quality of silence wherever he went, and no one in the Cauldron Foundation, not the board, not the executive director, not Mrs. Hale herself, had ever quite managed to be fully at ease in his company. Mrs. Hale watched him cross the marble foyer and thought, as she always did, that the man had never in his life needed to raise his voice to be heard. She was standing near the registration table, her clipboard in hand, when her eye moved, as it had been moving all evening, to the far end of the hall. The children's corner had been her idea, a draped partition, soft lighting, a cluster of low tables with paper and pencils, a pair of volunteers who read to the younger attendees while their parents worked the room. It was not glamorous. It was necessary. The volunteer coordinator for the evening was a young woman named Lena. Mrs. Hale had matched her with this gala herself, 3 weeks ago, after the original coordinator had taken ill. She had come recommended by the community programs director, reliable, precise, good with the children's families, no fuss. She had arrived that afternoon with 2 folding tables under one arm and a printed checklist in her coat pocket, and she had made the children's corner work without asking anyone for anything. Mrs. Hale had noticed her, in the way she noticed everything. A young woman in a plain navy dress, dark hair pinned back neatly, a kind and attentive face. Perhaps 27 or 28. A child of her own at the corner table, a little girl, no more than 3, sitting quietly with a sheet of paper and a red pencil, drawing something with great seriousness. Mrs. Hale had not, in 3 weeks of coordination, connected the name to anything else in her memory. The last time Lena had appeared in the Foundation's records, her name had been attached to a private donor visit, 4 years ago, arranged by Mrs. Hale at Vaughan's request. 3 years ago, that arrangement had quietly ended. Mrs. Hale had received a brief note, from Lena, not from Vaughan, thanking the Foundation for its hospitality, and that had been that. She was thinking about it now. Cale Vaughan had stepped into the main hall, accepted a glass of water from a passing server, and had begun the quiet, minimal circuit of the room that was his custom, a nod here, a word there. Mrs. Hale watched him from her station near the east wall when she saw him stop. Not slow down. Stop. He was standing perhaps 40 feet from the children's corner. He had turned, for no reason she could observe, toward the draped partition, and he had gone perfectly still in the way that a man goes still when the ground shifts beneath him and he has not yet decided what to do about it. Mrs. Hale followed his line of sight. Lena had stepped out from behind the partition to speak to one of the attending mothers. She had a pencil tucked behind one ear and a small paper cup of apple juice in one hand that clearly belonged to someone smaller than herself, and she was listening to the mother with the full, unhurried attention that Mrs. Hale had observed all evening, the attention of a person who genuinely meant to help. She had not looked toward the main hall. She did not appear to know that anyone was watching her. Cale Vaughan set his glass of water down on the nearest table without looking for it, and walked toward her. Mrs. Hale did not move. She was aware that her clipboard was in her hand and that she had entirely stopped tracking arrivals. She told herself she would resume in a moment. She did not resume in a moment. She was 12 feet away when he reached Lena. She heard him say her name, just the one word, quiet, without preamble. Lena's head came up. A very brief stillness passed over her face, the stillness of someone who has prepared, in some corner of herself, for exactly this possibility, and is now finding that preparation only goes so far. She did not take a step back. She did not look for an exit. She looked at him directly, with the same unhurried attention she had given the mother a moment before, and she said, "Mr. Vaughan." He said something Mrs. Hale could not hear. Lena's expression did not change in the way an uncertain person's expression changes. There was no wavering in it, no casting about. She simply listened, and then she said, quietly and clearly enough that Mrs. Hale caught the shape of it if not every word, "Her name is Petra. She is 3. She is at the table behind the partition." A pause. "She is yours." Mrs. Hale heard that part with complete clarity. Cale Vaughan did not speak immediately. He stood in the middle of the Cauldron Foundation's annual gala with the noise of 400 people moving and talking and laughing at a comfortable distance around him, and he was very quiet for several seconds. Mrs. Hale, who had watched this man conduct negotiations that lesser people described afterward in terms usually reserved for acts of nature, had never seen him look the way he looked in those seconds. He looked, she thought, like a man who has been handed something he had decided was gone and finds that his hands do not quite remember how to hold it. He said something else. Lena listened, and when he finished she nodded once, a small, considered movement, not reluctant, not eager. The movement of a person answering a question honestly. Then she said, "I am going to go back to the children now. If you would like to come and meet her, you are welcome to." She did not wait for his answer. She turned and walked back to the partition with the paper cup of apple juice and slipped behind the draped curtain. Cale Vaughan stood where she had left him for the length of time it takes to draw a breath and decide something. Then he followed her. Mrs. Hale was moving before she had consciously decided to move. Not toward the partition, she was not about to intrude, but to a position near the corner of the east wall where the gap between the partition and the wall allowed, for entirely professional reasons having to do with the room's sight lines, a partial view of the children's corner. She was entirely certain that not one of the 400 people in the room would follow him there. She could see, through the gap, a cluster of low tables and small chairs. 4 or 5 children of various ages, absorbed in drawings and quiet conversation. Lena at the far end, speaking to one of the volunteer readers in a low voice. And at the nearest table, alone with her red pencil and her sheet of paper, a small girl with dark hair, cut short, curling slightly at the ends, who was drawing what appeared to be a house with a very large door. Cale Vaughan crouched down. Mrs. Hale had seen this man in many configurations over 11 years, at the head of a conference table, across a formal dinner from a government minister, in this very foyer speaking words that made grown men nod without meeting his eyes. She had not seen him at the level of a children's table with his forearms on his knees and his head tipped to one side, looking at a drawing of a house with a very large door. The little girl looked up. She did not appear frightened. She had her mother's directness, Mrs. Hale observed, that same unhurried quality of assessment, the willingness to simply look at a person and wait for the evidence to arrive. She looked at Cale Vaughan with a pair of very dark, very serious eyes that Mrs. Hale recognized with a small, quiet jolt that she kept entirely to herself. He said something to the child. The child considered it. Then she picked up the red pencil and held it out to him, with the matter-of-fact generosity of a 3-year-old who has decided that a person can be trusted with her tools. He took it. Mrs. Hale turned away from the gap in the partition and looked at her clipboard without seeing it. She was a practical woman and she intended to remain one. She made a small notation in the margin of her seating chart, a mark only she would understand, straightened her shoulders, and went to check that the dessert course was progressing on schedule. It was 40 minutes before Cale Vaughan emerged from behind the partition. The gala had reached its warmest hour, the dinner cleared, the speeches done, the room settling into the comfortable noise of people who have eaten well and given generously and feel good about both. Mrs. Hale was near the registration table again, working through her end-of-evening checklist, when she saw him. He crossed the hall toward the children's corner, but Lena had come out from behind the partition at some point in the last few minutes, and she was standing near the east wall, her coat over her arm, her bag at her feet, the plain navy dress and the pencil still behind her ear and an expression on her face that Mrs. Hale could read only as a person who has done the hardest part and is now waiting to see what comes next. He stopped in front of her. He was not using the particular quality of stillness he used elsewhere in the room, the stillness that was really a form of pressure. He was simply standing in front of a young woman in a navy dress and he looked, in a way Mrs. Hale found she did not have a better word for, like a man who is being honest. he spoke. She listened. At one point she looked down at her coat and then back at him, and whatever he had said had not surprised her exactly. It had settled something she had held open and unresolved for 3 years and had not allowed herself to close. She said something. He nodded. She said something more, looking at him steadily, that same direct, unhurried attention, and whatever she said made him go quiet in the way Mrs. Hale recognized as the quiet of a man who has just received an answer he was not fully certain he would receive. He did not touch her hand. He made no gesture a stranger would have described as significant. He simply inclined his head once, the same small, deliberate movement she had given him earlier, and said something quietly that ended the conversation on a note both of them were prepared to accept. Lena picked up her bag. She said something with a small, composed movement of her mouth, a condition, or simply a last practical thing. He listened. He nodded. And then she excused herself, walked back to the partition, and a moment later reappeared with her coat on and a small, dark-haired child riding on her hip, the little girl, still holding the red pencil, looking at the room with the calm curiosity of a person gathering information about a world that has more in it than she was previously aware. Cale Vaughan watched them leave. He stood in the middle of the Cauldron Foundation Gala, among 400 people who had spent the evening navigating a careful distance around him, and he watched Lena carry his daughter through the marble foyer and out into the night, and the expression on his face was one that Mrs. Hale had never seen on it before. She did not try to name it immediately. She finished her checklist. She spoke briefly to the executive director, supervised the first wave of table clearing, and said goodnight to 3 board members. It was only later, in the car on her way home, that she allowed herself to think it through properly. She had known, when she arranged that first meeting 4 years ago, that something in Cale Vaughan's careful, self-contained life had shifted enough for him to ask it of her. She had not known what the young woman would mean to him, or what had separated them 3 years ago, or what Lena had carried since, alone, with complete dignity, no claim made on anyone. She knew only what she had seen tonight, a young woman who told the truth plainly and stood where she was and did not ask for anything she had not been freely offered, and a man who had walked into a room full of people who were afraid of him and been made entirely ordinary by a small dark-eyed child offering him a red pencil. Mrs. Hale had worked for the Cauldron Foundation for 23 years. She reached into her bag, found the seating chart, and looked at the small mark she had made in the margin. Then she folded it, put it away, and looked out the window at the city going past, and thought that the most feared man alive had asked tonight, plainly and without condition, whether he might come back. And a young woman in a plain navy dress, who had never needed him to be anything other than honest, had said yes. That, Mrs. Hale thought, was enough. That was, in fact, everything.